In the aftermath of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the world's dominant powers. By the summer of 1945, while the primary focus was on troop redeployment and the establishment of occupation zones, military and political leaders also turned their attention to a vital post-war task, analyzing the conflict's lessons and implications. One of the earliest and most complex challenges faced by the victorious Allies in Europe was the governance of conquered Germany. This responsibility required close collaboration and mutual trust among the Allied powers. In Germany itself, a nation once believed to be nearly invincible, devastation lay in every direction, a stark landscape of ruin and desolation. Our wartime experiences underscored the essential importance of unity, coordination, and cooperation in achieving military success. The Allied victory, the greatest in the history of warfare, was the result of many factors. Was the remarkable achievement of the American soldier.
I have the proud privilege of speaking for a victorious army of almost 5 million fighting men. They, and the women who have so ably assisted them, constitute the Allied expeditionary forces that have liberated Western Europe. They have captured or destroyed enemy armies totaling more than their own strength. They have pushed triumphantly forward over the hundreds of miles, separating Cherbourg from Lübeck, Munich, and Leipzig. But all these agree with me in the selection of the truly heroic figure of this war. He is G.I. Joe and his counterpart in the air, the Navy, and the merchant marine of every one of the United Nations. He has braved the dangers of U-boat infested seas. He has surmounted charges into desperately defended beaches. He has fought his tedious, patient way through the ultimate in fortified zones. He has endured cold, hunger, fatigue. His companion has been danger. Death has dogged his footsteps. He and his platoon commanders have given us an example of loyalty, devotion to duty, and indomitable courage that will live in our hearts as long as we admire those qualities in men.
In June 1945, General Eisenhower returned to the United States by order of the government to take part in nationwide celebrations honoring the victorious troops from the European theater. Across the country, Americans welcomed their heroes with profound gratitude and pride. Perhaps the most significant and lasting lesson of the Mediterranean and European campaigns was the undeniable success of multinational cooperation in wartime. Historic rivalries and deep-seated doubts were overcome. Governments, along with their military, political, and economic institutions, united in a single, focused effort. Remarkably, this massive coalition faced no major breakdowns caused by conflicting national interests, a powerful testament to what unity among nations can achieve. The effectiveness of the Allied forces in World War II demonstrated once and for all the viability of creating and operating unified command structures capable of withstanding the most demanding tests of modern warfare. The critical foundation for this success lay in the willingness of national leaders to put aside purely national interests when it came to the strategic deployment of combined resources. Equally essential was the appointment of a single theater commander, fully empowered and supported without reservation. Once these conditions were in place, success depended on the vision, leadership, skill, and judgment of the professional military personnel who filled command and staff positions. During World War II, The United States and Great Britain recognized and applied these principles with discipline and effectiveness. Among the most significant military lessons of the war was the transformative role of air power. In the European theater, air power evolved almost daily, with new and increasingly effective uses emerging throughout the campaign. The strategic bombing and air support efforts had a decisive impact on German military strength, weakening the enemy on both the eastern and western fronts. Beyond combat roles, air power played a vital logistical function, especially during rapid advances across France and into Germany, enabling the swift movement of supplies and troops that would otherwise have been impossible. These operations would not have achieved their remarkable speed and success without air support. The war reaffirmed a fundamental truth. Unity, coordination, and cooperation are the cornerstones of successful military operations. While warfare spans the land, sea, and air, these elements must function as an integrated whole. There is no such thing as a purely land, air, or naval war. We also reevaluated the central figure in any military effort, the individual soldier. The American soldier, once trained, proved uniquely capable. His initiative, adaptability, and practical ingenuity set him apart. When armed with technical proficiency in the essentials of combat, he became a highly formidable force. Veteran units generally performed more effectively than inexperienced formations. Yet battle-hardened troops held no greater desire to face enemy fire than new recruits. What set them apart was their ability to make full use of available firepower, mobility, and terrain. Early in the war, it became clear that a soldier's emotional resilience and spiritual strength were as vital to success as his weapons and training. Morale was not a luxury. It was a decisive factor in combat effectiveness. The campaigns in the Mediterranean and Europe were unprecedented in both scope and complexity. The U.S. Army undertook operations unparalleled in its history since its founding in 1775. In total, the European and North African operations required the mobilization and coordination of a vast ground force centered on 47 infantry divisions and their supporting artillery. Some divisions shouldered a disproportionate share of the combat burden. The 34th, 45th, 3rd, and 1st Infantry Divisions, for example, were in battle between 438 and over 500 days. An extraordinary record of endurance and sacrifice. No pre-war doctrine or mission statement could have accurately anticipated the scale, complexity, or demands of the campaign against the European Axis powers. Victory in the Mediterranean and European campaigns delivered a decisive rebuttal to those who claimed that democracies were too weak, too complacent, or too disunited to prevail in a global conflict. The results of these campaigns proved that free nations could fight with determination, produce with unmatched efficiency, and sacrifice collectively in pursuit of a just cause. Throughout the war, scientific innovation played a transformative role. In countless ways, researchers and inventors reshaped the nature of modern warfare. In early July 1945, I was informed of a forthcoming test of a new weapon, a product of American scientific ingenuity, the atomic bomb. Though I was aware of its potential significance, I expressed hope at the time that it would never need to be used. The thought of the United States leading the world into a new age of destruction weighed heavily on me. I was not yet fully aware of the vast, secret effort behind its development, or the urgency with which the scientific community had pursued this breakthrough. Then, in July 1945, deep in the New Mexico desert near Alamogordo, the most consequential scientific experiment in human history unfolded under a veil of secrecy.
The automatic controls got it now. Rob, this time the stakes are really high.
It's going to work all right, Robert. And I'm sure we'll never be sorry for it.
Well, in 40 seconds, we'll know.
Only a select group of top scientists, men like Dr. Vannevar Bush and Harvard President James Bryant Conant, and key government officials knew the magnitude of what was about to occur. The moment of detonation marked a turning point in civilization. In just seconds, the landscape of warfare changed irrevocably. All prior advancements in military technology, whether in weapons, strategy, or logistics, now seemed like mere stepping stones to this new, terrifying threshold. When the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, the reports that followed left no room for doubt. A new era had begun. Centuries-old assumptions about warfare were instantly obsolete. From that moment forward, the logical objective of any future aggressor would likely be to amass atomic weapons and use them without warning against the industrial infrastructure and civilian populations of rival nations. Compared to this, even the massive devastation left behind in Germany seemed only a faint echo of what future wars might bring. Yet the evidence of destruction wrought by conventional war was still all around us. Germany lay shattered, its bridges collapsed, cities in ruins, factories silenced, and its once formidable industrial machine brought to a standstill. Between September 1939 and May 1945, tens of millions had perished across Europe, and countless more were displaced or left homeless. In Germany, after years of apparent invincibility, only ruin remained, a landscape flattened by ambition, arrogance, and unchecked aggression. Among the most haunting memories for American veterans of the European theater are those of the displaced persons, men, women, and children who had lost everything, or who could not return home for fear of renewed persecution. Their plight symbolized the deeper tragedy of a continent scarred by hatred and division. Volumes have already been written, and many more will follow, on the collapse of global cooperation and the far-reaching consequences of this catastrophe. But the war's legacy is clear. Humanity entered a new age, and with it, a new and sobering responsibility. I hoped, and deeply felt, that the devastating lessons of 6 relentless years of global war would convince all nations that the use of force in international affairs must be renounced once and for all. The first major challenge facing the Allies after victory in Europe was the governance of a defeated Germany, a task that demanded genuine cooperation and mutual trust among the victors. From our wartime interactions with the Soviet Union, we understood by the summer of 1945 that the success of joint administration would depend largely on our ability, at both the strategic and local levels, to overcome Russian suspicion and deeply rooted distrust. The divide between political systems was vast, and bridging that gulf would test the unity and resolve of the Allied powers. For all humanity, 1945 was a pivotal year. 1 month before the European war came to an end, the world was shaken by the sudden death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On April 12th, a day that began with hope ended in profound sorrow. Free people across the globe mourned the loss of a leader who had guided them through years of darkness. A generation earlier, in 1918, American soldiers had looked to global leaders to build a peace worthy of their sacrifice. They were betrayed by failed diplomacy. We failed them then. We cannot fail again, because to do so may mean the end of civilization as we know it. If the nations of the world are ever to achieve lasting peace, they must be willing to share sovereignty, pooling limited authority in a central body with the power to enforce collective decisions. Only through such unity can international order be established. Yet, in the formation of the United Nations, this principle had not yet been fully embraced. A democracy can offer no better protection to its soldiers than thorough training, physical, technical, and psychological, before asking them to risk their lives in battle. But because democracies often find themselves entering war unprepared, this training must take place during times of peace. Until global peace is a reality and disarmament a logical outcome, it is irresponsible, even criminal, to deny soldiers the preparation they need to survive. The tragic lessons of 1914 and 1939 remain painfully relevant. Until the world rejects the notion that war, competitive force, can settle human disputes, those lessons will remain unfinished and unheeded. At the close of World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union stood alone as the two dominant global powers. The end of the most catastrophic conflict in human history was met with euphoric celebration in Moscow. After 4 years of brutal and exhausting warfare, the Soviet people were overwhelmed with relief and pride. Germany's defeat marked a turning point for the Soviet Union, a moment of rising stature and global influence. With the surrender of Nazi Germany in Berlin, the USSR reached new heights of geopolitical importance. From that moment forward, the Soviet Union would possess a powerful voice in shaping the post-war world, and a central role in the fragile pursuit of a lasting peace. The formal surrender at Berlin occurred 2 days after Germany had first capitulated to Allied forces at Reims, officially ending the European chapter of the war. It was a conclusion heavy with triumph, but equally heavy with responsibility. According to the surrender terms, the top commanders of the German armed forces were required to appear in Berlin on May 9th to formally sign a ratification at Soviet headquarters. This second event served as a clear signal to both Germany and the world that the surrender was made to all Allied powers, not just the Western Allies. Under the watchful and satisfied eyes of the Soviet commanders, Field Marshal General Wilhelm Keitel, Hitler's chief military leader, signed the surrender. Air Chief Marshal Tedder signed on behalf of the Western Allies, and Marshal Zhukov signed for the Soviets. Less than a month later, representatives of the 4 victorious nations convened in Berlin for the inaugural meeting of the Allied Control Council, which was tasked with governing post-war Germany. At that point, it became clear that the future of global peace and civilization would depend heavily on the ability of East and West to collaborate and coexist in a shared world. The Nazi defeat sparked ongoing celebrations across the Allied nations. For the Russians, the surrender held special meaning, and they took particular satisfaction in witnessing the defeat and humiliation of the Nazi military leadership. Their experience in the war had been devastating. The Soviet Union had suffered such immense human loss, men, women, and children alike, that the total number of lives lost could never be accurately counted. In 1941, Nazi forces overran nearly the entire western part of the country, and everything from the Volga River westward was left in ruins. Any nation would have been deeply embittered by such suffering. It would have been remarkable if the Russians had not felt a more personal and intense sense of vengeance toward the Germans and adopted a harsher view of war. Marshal Zhukov and I often spoke about the war's campaigns. From our conversations, it became clear that many of the practices we considered vital to preserving morale and protecting our troops, such as the regular rotation of units and strategies to reduce unnecessary battlefield risk, were largely absent or unfamiliar in the Soviet approach. Even during their most successful offensives, the Soviet forces endured staggering losses. For the Russians, great victories seemed to come only through great sacrifice. Zhukov, due to his pivotal role in the Red Army, had more experience leading large-scale battles than perhaps any other commander of his era. He was regularly dispatched to the front lines where the fighting was fiercest, and many German retreats were directly attributed to his strategic leadership. He and I agreed that the destruction of enemy morale was always a central objective. Yet in nearly every respect, the Russian and American ways of waging war reflected fundamentally different mindsets. The Soviet army prioritized inflicting maximum losses on the enemy, often showing little mercy. For German soldiers, capture by Soviet forces was feared far more than surrendering to the Western Allies. It was only in the final phases of the war that the Soviets began to see military results that matched the enormous price they had paid in blood and endurance. Though proud of their victories, the Russians never forgot their cost. The extraordinary suffering of the people, the years of deprivation, and the devastation wrought across the Western Soviet Union made the Eastern Front one of the most brutal and tragic chapters in modern military history. Everywhere, the scars of Hitler's ruthless ambition were plainly visible, in the land, in the cities, and in the people who survived. Every battle, every engagement on the front lines came at a steep cost, paid in shattered bodies and the lives of young Allied soldiers. In February 1945, the leaders of the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union gathered at Yalta, in Crimea, to determine how the post-war world, especially the administration of a defeated Germany, would be shaped. Looking back at the historical relationship between America and Russia, there was little reason to anticipate hostility. For generations, the two nations had enjoyed a steady, uninterrupted friendship, dating back to the founding of the United States. With only brief diplomatic pauses, their relations had generally remained cordial. Unlike many European powers, both countries were relatively untainted by colonial conquest through force. Twice in modern history, they had stood as allies in war. Since 1941, the cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union had been essential to defeating the Axis powers in Europe. Yet beneath this alliance, a deep ideological divide separated the two, each championing opposing systems of government and visions of society. This divide carried the potential to fracture the post-war world into two rival camps. If unresolved, it could spark yet another devastating conflict. But if that gulf could be crossed, if the two powers could learn to cooperate pragmatically, the foundations for a lasting global peace could be secured. No other division among nations posed such a serious threat to world unity, provided mutual trust between America and the Soviet Union could be achieved. Still, obstacles loomed large. Doubts, fears, and the weight of historical suspicion cast long shadows over U.S.-Soviet relations. Yet the consequences of failure were too terrible to accept. All efforts had to be made to find common ground and push forward in the hope of peace. Some Americans have since argued that the U.S. should have raced to Berlin to solidify post-war influence. But in March 1945, as our forces stood at the Rhine, Berlin was still 300 miles away, with the Elbe River another 200 miles beyond that. Meanwhile, Soviet troops were already entrenched just 30 miles outside the German capital. From a military standpoint, launching an immediate drive toward Berlin would have been reckless. With the war in Europe concluded, the relationship between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union quickly emerged as a critical global concern. In early August, General Eisenhower received an official invitation to visit Moscow, extended personally by the Soviet leadership. He accepted without hesitation. The visit served as an important diplomatic gesture, signaling goodwill toward our wartime ally. Like many Americans, Eisenhower was also naturally curious about Russia, its people, its culture, and its way of life. Shortly after our arrival, the Generalissimo extended a unique invitation to me and two of my colleagues. We were offered the rare opportunity to stand atop Lenin's tomb during a public celebration. I was informed that this gesture was unprecedented. No foreigner had ever been granted such an honor. Recognizing the significance of the invitation, I accepted with gratitude. For 5 hours we stood on the tomb, witnessing a stunning display of national pride. There were traditional folk dances, synchronized gymnastics, acrobatic performances, and athletic exhibitions, all carried out with extraordinary precision and an almost infectious enthusiasm. None of us had seen anything like it before. It was an unforgettable introduction to a nation we had only known through the lens of war. While I appreciated the opportunity to visit a country new to me, I was even more encouraged by the implication that the Soviet leadership was, at that time, genuinely interested in fostering friendly relations with the West. Much of Russia had been left in ruins by the war. Soon after Victory in Europe Day, citizens across the Soviet Union, particularly in places like Stalingrad, began the enormous task of reconstruction. In many cities, rebuilding meant starting almost from scratch, raising new communities from the rubble of war. At that moment in history, there seemed no reason why the Soviet system and the democratic ideals of the Western Allies could not coexist peacefully, provided that each respected the other's sovereignty, values, and way of life. As long as both refrained from hostile actions, whether overt or covert, against the other's integrity. Peaceful coexistence felt not only possible, but reasonable. At the heart of Western democracy lies a fundamental respect for the rights and freedoms of others. Although General Eisenhower found many aspects of daily life in Russia surprisingly similar to life in America, he was convinced that reconciling the ideologies of East and West was a far more complex and difficult challenge. Marshal Zhukov appeared to be a steadfast adherent to the principles of communism. While I rejected those beliefs entirely and stood firmly opposed to any system rooted in dictatorship, there was no doubt in my mind that Zhukov's convictions were sincere. As the wartime alliance began to fade into history, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union steadily deepened. Nowhere was this growing rift more visible than in Germany, where the two powers frequently found themselves at odds over the administration of the defeated nation. The most dangerous flashpoint came with the Soviet blockade of Berlin, an attempt to sever the western sectors of the city from critical supplies. It brought the world perilously close to a new crisis. That act of Soviet coercion was met with resolve. The British and American response, the Berlin airlift, sustained the city for 11 months, defying the blockade and ultimately forcing the Soviets to abandon their effort. Still, the years that followed marked a steady unraveling of the post-war vision. The hope for swift, unified progress toward lasting peace and global disarmament began to dim. When the United Nations was born at the San Francisco Conference, the world saw it as a fresh chance for international cooperation and understanding. But the dream of unity requires more than declarations. It demands a willingness to adapt. The democracies must recognize that the world is now too interconnected for the rigid nationalism of the past. In an era when no nation is truly self-sufficient, isolation is no longer a viable path to security or prosperity. No country can afford to stand alone. If the American people confront this challenge with the same courage and clarity that their soldiers displayed in the crucible of World War II, then we need not fear the future.
Between the victory in Europe and the final victory in Japan, in this most destructive of all wars, you have won a victory against war itself. If we had had this charter a few years ago, and above all, the will to use it, millions now dead would be alive. If we should falter in the future in our will to use it, millions now living will surely die.
If the men and women of America can uphold the moral strength, clear understanding, and willingness to sacrifice that ultimately defeated the Axis powers, then freedom will endure, and with it, the hope that all nations may one day achieve a level of culture, peace, and security never before seen in human history. For millions of Americans, whether privates or five-star generals, their service in World War II remains the defining chapter of their lives. This vast global conflict, which spanned 6 years, claimed the lives of roughly 30 million people, both military and civilian. With a grim sense of justice, Germany, the nation that unleashed the war, was left in ruins. Victory came at a staggering cost. 13 million soldiers of the Allied forces perished in the fight. This devastating war, which engulfed continents, was sparked by a single man. In the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler began his ruthless rise to power, parading the growing force of his Nazi regime. Through propaganda and fear, he mesmerized millions of Germans, convincing them to follow his fanatical vision. Emboldened by early successes, the Nazis launched a relentless march across Europe. In just 9 months, they had conquered 6 nations, but each triumph only fed Hitler's hunger for domination. On a dark day in June 1940, German troops entered Paris. The once vibrant French capital quickly became a silent, subdued outpost of the Nazi occupation. With the European mainland under his control, Hitler turned his sights to Britain, unleashing a merciless aerial assault. In the pivotal Battle of Britain, relentless bombing by the Luftwaffe was met with unshakable resolve by the British people. from factory workers to Prime Minister Winston Churchill himself. As Churchill declared,
"Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour."
By December 1941, Japan had removed all doubt about America's role in the war.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Across the perilous waters of the North Atlantic, American ships forged a vital lifeline, delivering troops and supplies to England in preparation for a direct confrontation with Nazi Germany. In the fading days of autumn 1942, an immense and silent convoy, carrying over 1 million tons of men and materiel, steamed toward Gibraltar. It marked the beginning of the first major Allied offensive against the Axis powers and the largest battle fleet ever assembled up to that point. To the Allies' surprise, the convoys reached their destination unchallenged. The assault plan called for simultaneous landings at 3 key points along the North African coast. At dawn on November 8, 1942, Allied forces stormed ashore at Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers. Uncertainty hung in the air. How would the French forces, loyal to the Vichy regime, respond? On most beaches, resistance was light or quickly subdued. Within hours, all 3 landing zones were secured, laying the foundation for a broader push eastward. What followed were 6 grueling months of relentless combat. American troops, many seeing battle for the first time, proved their mettle in ferocious clashes with hardened German forces. Their courage and resilience were soon matched by the British 8th Army, advancing from the east through the harsh Libyan desert. Trapped between 2 Allied armies, the German Africa Corps found itself squeezed into an ever-shrinking stronghold. The noose tightened with each passing day. Eventually, Axis resistance collapsed completely. Nazi forces were driven from the African continent. By the campaign's end, 240,000 Axis troops had surrendered in Tunisia, many of them elite German and Italian units, including what remained of the vaunted Africa Corps. It was a sweeping victory, and on May 20th, 1943, the Allies celebrated in triumph at the Straits of Tunis. The next phase of the Allied strategy targeted Europe itself. First came the planned invasion of Sicily, followed by landings on the Italian mainland. For the first time in history, American paratroopers were deployed on a massive scale, preparing to lead the charge onto enemy soil in a new and decisive chapter of the war. On July 10, 1943, Allied forces launched their assault on Sicily. In just 38 days, the strategically vital Mediterranean island was fully secured. From there, the campaign turned toward the European mainland. British forces under General Bernard Montgomery prepared to cross the narrow Messina Strait into southern Italy. While farther up the coast, the American Fifth Army landed near Salerno just days later, marking the next phase of the Allied advance. The Italian campaign proved to be one of the most grueling of the war. American troops faced fierce German resistance, compounded by treacherous mountain terrain, persistent rain, disease, and bitter cold. Meanwhile, in London, January 1944 marked a major turning point in Allied leadership. General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces. With his staff, He immediately began planning the massive cross-channel invasion that would strike at the heart of Nazi-occupied France. The plan, known as Operation Overlord, called for 2 million Allied troops to land along the Normandy coast. Their mission? Break through German defenses, push inland, and ultimately encircle and neutralize Germany's industrial stronghold in the Ruhr Valley. To support this, a secondary invasion was also scheduled for the southern coast of France. As D-Day approached, Allied air forces pounded railways, bridges, and roads leading from the beaches into the French interior. These targeted strikes aimed to delay German reinforcements once the landings began. Then, in the early hours of June 6, 1944, a massive fleet, over 4,000 ships and landing craft, began ferrying the invasion force across the English Channel. It was the largest amphibious assault in history. More than 150,000 Allied troops were aboard, and virtually every type of assault vessel was part of the vast armada. The sea crossing was unopposed, but as the coast of Normandy came into view, Allied warships opened fire on German fortifications. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. For many soldiers, this was their first experience in combat. As they sat in the landing craft, seasick and soaked, they knew the fate of the invasion, and perhaps the war, rested on their shoulders. The Nazis had not anticipated an invasion at that time or place, and scrambled to mount a powerful counterattack. The beaches were heavily defended, and the battle quickly became intense and bloody. Nowhere was the resistance fiercer than at Omaha Beach. There, American troops faced brutal machine gun fire and artillery as they struggled to establish even a narrow foothold. Some landing craft were hit by heavy seas and swamped before they reached shore, leaving exhausted soldiers in no shape to fight. Despite these immense challenges, the Allies held on. On June 7th, the day after the invasion, General Eisenhower and Admiral Bertram Ramsay, his naval commander-in-chief, toured the battlefront by destroyer. They witnessed firsthand the aftermath of one of the most daring and consequential military operations in history. D-Day marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, but the road to victory would still demand enormous sacrifice. With the beachhead in Normandy firmly secured, Allied forces advanced inland, determined to keep German troops off balance and on the defensive. The push through the French coastal regions was met with fierce resistance, and brutal combat unfolded across every sector of the front. Undeterred, American and Allied troops relentlessly battered Nazi positions. Less than 12 weeks after the D-Day landings, Allied forces reached the outskirts of Paris. On August 25, 1944, German forces in the capital surrendered. 2 days later, General Eisenhower, accompanied by General Omar Bradley and Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, entered the liberated city quietly. With reinforcements from the Allied landings in southern France, the combined forces pressed eastward across France, closing in on the German border. But the fight was far from over. In December 1944, Hitler launched a desperate, last-ditch counteroffensive in the Ardennes region, a surprise attack that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. It was a powerful and unexpected blow. 3 German armies, including 14 infantry and 10 panzer divisions, struck hard against a lightly defended stretch of the Allied line, creating a deep bulge in the front. By late December, the Allies mounted a fierce counterattack. General George Patton's Third Army pushed northward, while the First Army struck from the north, gradually squeezing the Germans into retreat. Despite harsh winter conditions and heavy losses, Allied troops regained lost ground. By mid-January 1945, the German advance had been halted and the front lines restored. The Battle of the Bulge had lasted over a month and inflicted heavy losses, but it had also dealt a crippling blow to Hitler's forces. German armies emerged from the Ardennes campaign weakened, depleted, and unable to recover the massive quantities of men and equipment they had lost. From that point on, the Allies maintained momentum, driving the reeling Nazi war machine back toward its final collapse. Among the most formidable obstacles facing the Allied armies was the mighty Rhine River, a natural defensive barrier steeped in history. Crossing it would prove critical to the final push into the heart of Nazi Germany. For General Eisenhower, the Rhine crossing was a decisive milestone, one that would accelerate the collapse of Nazi resistance. Supporting these amphibious assaults was a daring airborne operation the following morning. 2 airborne divisions, composed of paratroopers and glider-borne troops, descended behind enemy lines in what became the most successful airborne mission of the entire war. Their swift actions helped secure the eastern bank of the Rhine, allowing ground forces to consolidate their position and press relentlessly deeper into Germany. Prime Minister Winston Churchill undoubtedly felt a profound satisfaction as he symbolically stepped onto the far side of the Rhine, Germany's traditional defensive stronghold. This moment likely represented more than just a tactical victory. It marked the turning point in overcoming an enemy who, 5 years earlier, had pushed Britain to the brink of defeat. In the weeks that followed, the Allied offensive gained unstoppable momentum. Along the way, many American soldiers previously captured by the Nazis were liberated from prison camps. Just 7 weeks after the initial crossing of the Rhine, American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River, signaling the imminent collapse of Nazi Germany. Under the leadership of Marshal Zhukov, Russian forces advanced relentlessly into the heart of Berlin. The final Nazi defenders capitulated on May 3rd, bringing an end to the desperate and futile defense of the German capital, a struggle that had cost the Germans an estimated 500,000 soldiers killed or captured. After 4 grueling years marked by a series of monumental battles, it was the Soviet army that claimed victory in Berlin. Meanwhile, the Nazis surrendered formally across several fronts. On May 4th at Lüneburg Heath, they relinquished control of their northern forces to the Allies, represented by Field Marshal Montgomery. The complete surrender of Nazi Germany came on May 7th at Reims. There, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, one of Hitler's most trusted commanders, signed the unconditional capitulation on behalf of the German High Command. General Walter Bedell Smith represented the United States and the Allied nations in accepting the surrender, signaling the end of the most devastating war in history.
The Allied force, which invaded Europe on June 6, 1944, has, with its great Russian allies and forces advancing from the south, utterly defeated the Germans by land, sea, and air. This unconditional surrender has been achieved by teamwork. Teamwork not only among all the allies participating, but among all the services, land, sea, and air. To every subordinate that has been in this command of almost 5 million allies, I owe a debt of gratitude that can never be repaid. The only repayment that can be made to them is a deep appreciation and lasting gratitude of all free citizens of all the United Nations.